I'm particularly delighted to see so many educators and others who've been working for excellence and equity in America's schools. Everyone in this room knows what an enormous challenge the achievement gap is for our nation, and many have spoken eloquently about the moral consequences. Our work focuses on the economic consequences of the achievement gap. Overall, there are three major findings to the research. First, the complexity of the gap, which is really, in our view, four gaps. There are profound and troubling gaps along race and income lines, but the gap between the US and other rich countries is very large, as are the achievement gaps among and within the many education systems in our country. So the achievement gap affects not only poor children in failing schools, it affects most children in most schools. Second, the economic costs of this gap are enormous, imposing on the United States economy the equivalent of a permanent and deep national recession. This gap and the economic costs of it are bigger in its macroeconomic impact than our current credit-driven recession. Third, there are some powerful reasons for hope. Demographics need not be destiny, and systems do matter. We can learn from what the most successful educators and school systems are doing in our own country to close these achievement gaps, and we can also learn from other countries. So let's start with our international achievement gap. Relative to their wealthy country peers, our children start off roughly in the middle of the pack, but by the time they reach high school, they fall into the back of the pack. For example, the OECD's PISA exam in math for 15-year-olds, our 15-year-olds are now ranked 25th out of 30 countries. Moreover, very few students from the United States perform at the very highest international levels. Countries like Korea, Switzerland, and Belgium have at least 5 times the number of students scoring at the highest level of proficiency. So specifically, the gap between students from high income and low income families is much more pronounced in the United States than it is in other OECD nations. So this graph takes OECD data, and you see the United States right in the middle. Everyone right in that middle point. All the countries above that line are doing better in overall performance for their kids. Their kids are performing better overall, on average. Everyone to the left side of the line has more equitable outcomes. In other words, in those countries, the impact of being from a poor family is less than it is in the United States. So if you take a look at those two and look at the upper left-hand quadrant, 17 countries, 17 out of 30 countries in the OECD do both. They do better for their kids overall, and they get more equal outcomes. Just think about that. The United States, a country which had a decades-long head start in universal primary education and universal secondary education, a country to which generations of immigrants crossed oceans to seek opportunity for their children. 17 nations today have both higher and more equitable results in education, the most fundamental basis of opportunity. It's a troubling fact. Let's break it down a little bit more. Let's look next at the achievement gap by race and ethnicity. Now, no matter what achievement or attainment measures you use, whether standardized tests, high school graduation, college graduation, Black and Latino students achieve at significantly lower levels than their white counterparts. Take, for example, performance on the National Assessment of Educational Progress 4th grade math test. As you can see on the left-hand side, 3 to 4 times as many Black and Latino students as white students are performing at below basic levels. Now, this is very bad news, but it's also pretty well known. Less well known, on the right-hand side, is that only 1% of Black and Latino students are performing at advanced levels, just an eighth of that for white students. Remember, these are the students who are already being prepared to be the engineers and entrepreneurs and to have the high-wage jobs of the future. These gaps occur throughout the country, across subjects and grade levels, even in the highest performing states. Massachusetts, for example, has the highest scores in the country on math, but still 8 times as many Black and Latino students perform below basic as white students. And, like the international gap, the racial gap gets worse as our students get older. Between grades 4 and 12, the achievement gap between white and Latino students grows by 41%, and that between white and Black students grows by 22%. Unfortunately, the picture is not much better when we look at the achievement gap by income. Take, for example, NAEP in grade 8. Using eligibility for free and reduced lunches as a proxy for low income, we see similar disparities. 6 times as many low-income students perform below basic on grade 4 math, and 4 times as many in reading. Average scores for low-income students, as you can see on this chart, are 26 points behind in math and 24 points behind in reading. Those aren't just points, those aren't just numbers, those are years of learning. It's roughly about 2.5 years of learning that represents. One question you might ask is whether, since so many Black and Latino youth live in conditions of poverty in this country, whether the racial gaps and the income gaps are really the same phenomenon. And the answer is no. Both the racial and the income gaps coexist and compound each other. Back to 4th grade math. There's an income achievement gap of about 1.5 years of school, both for white students and for Black students. So, for example, poor white students, as you see, are performing about 16 points below. That's, again, 1.5 years behind white students. And it's the same for Black students between those of higher income and those of lower income. But in addition to that, there's a racial achievement gap between whites and Black students in similar income strata. It all adds up to an enormous gap in achievement between white students from families of means and Black students living in poverty. So if you take the two ends of the spectrum, you've got 3.5 years of learning difference. Again, these results are deeply troubling, but perhaps not surprising if you've been following these issues. But it turns out there is another achievement gap, about as large as the racial and income gaps put together. And that's the systems gap. Perhaps the most surprising result from our research is the enormous variation of outcomes across education systems. And there's a lot more data on this in the actual report and in the appendix we'll be posting on the website. But the bottom line is this: systems matter. Districts matter. Schools matter. Students from the same racial and socioeconomic backgrounds who are in different states have significantly different performance. New Jersey and Connecticut, for example. New Jersey has better NAEP results and a smaller racial achievement gap, despite having a lower income per capita and a higher proportion of racial and ethnic minorities than Connecticut. It's about half a year's difference in learning between the two. Or Texas and California, two states with very similar demographics. On average, California students, Black, white, and Latino, are 1 to 2 years of learning behind comparable students in Texas. So state systems matter. Within states, similar students in different districts also perform very differently. For example, when we looked at 4 urban Texas districts with similar poverty levels and minority populations, and 1/4 more students are proficient in math in the best performing of them than in the other 3. And even within districts, similar students at different schools perform differently. We looked at 2 high-poverty, majority Black middle schools in the same Texas school district. Students at one school performed 20 to 30 points better on state tests. So schools matter. And we know from the evidence in the United States and internationally that teachers and teaching matter a great deal.